So, Michael, I'm thrilled to have you on today. I mentioned to you this before, but I'm going to tell you again, is that I invited you on this podcast because the types of themes that we talk about, I think, are so aligned with some of the things that you write about. And I've been following your work and I'm a fan of yours for years. So I thought, wow, what a perfect person to have on this podcast to talk about all things leadership, and especially, some of the themes that you talk about in terms of creativity. You talk about connection. You talk about healing organizations. I mean, there's so many different themes that I think are so related. So before we even get started, so let's talk about who's Michael. So if you, who are you? They heard your introduction and they heard all that, but talk a little bit about yourself, your journey, and how you got to be doing what you do.
Sure. Well, I had two criteria for what I would do. And those two criteria were that first, it had to be something that I would love, that would be creative and allow me to quest for wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
So another word for questing for wholeness is healing.
Mm.
And then I knew that what I wanted to do was something that would help others, that would effectively be healing for others, help others find wholeness. And that's not surprising. My dad was an oral surgeon for 45 years. He specialized in taking care of people who had been messed up by regular dentists. So
Wow.
and the reason he was so successful, he was technically excellent, but he was caring, he was kind, and he made people feel safe. And my mom was a psychotherapist, working in the Passaic County Mental Health Clinic. So she was working with people who were referred by the state, who had very minimal resources. And, we often used to joke that after taking care of all of these very difficult people, that was all made much easier by the fact that she raised me first. But so we should, the
She had
nickname for
experience, right? Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
My parents, we used to call them mental and dental.
Oh my gosh, that's fun.
But the underlying through line is, that it
Mm.
never occurred to me to do something that wasn't healing in the healing realm, both for others, but I also thought it was wise to do something that I would love, that would be good for me. So those were my criteria. And then those principles led me on this amazing journey where I've done all sorts of things. I never thought I'd be in the corporate world. When I was growing up, the business was the military industrial complex and scorching the earth and exploiting workers. And the last thing I thought is that I'd wind up in a 40+ year career as a leadership coach and helping create cultures of creativity and innovation in companies around the world.
Especially when you use the words quest for wholeness, right? When you say quest for wholeness, right? Because I want to latch onto that, because I think it's an important thing, because I think that's an essence of a journey. How would you define that? Like, what's I think we're on some level all on that quest.
Sure.
But what made you know that that's what you were on?
So, at first I was going to major in political science, because I thought, but it soon occurred to me that.
So was I. That's funny.
That
same here, by me too. It's weird, yeah. Right? And it's fascinating. That's where I started, was political science, and then I ended up as a leadership person, right? So,
me too. Too.
Uh-huh.
It's understanding the mind, psychology. Why do people do what they do? Why are people not thinking? Leonardo Da Vinci once said the greatest delusion people suffer is from their own opinions. Mm-hmm. And I think as William James said, most of what people call thinking is just rearranging their prejudices. Mm-hmm. So I was interested in, how do you really think? How do you really think about issues? Because it occurred to me, rather than focusing on the issues, if people didn't know how to think about them, I wanted to focus on the thinking. So I majored in psychology, but I saw that a lot of my professors, as brilliant as they were, I mean, they were academic. So it was academic. And you know, in the business world, the word academic means basically irrelevant.
Right. Right. Ivory tower, right? Like, yeah,
Not practical.
yeah.
Uh, and they didn't seem to translate their understanding of academic psychology into their own personal integration. So we talk about wholeness. Here's an example of what it isn't. I had a professor who was one of the world experts in nonverbal communication, but he would lecture to us, and his body was so unconscious and so expressive of unconscious negative patterns. I remember looking at him thinking, what is wrong with this picture? I felt like the kid who sees the emperor has no clothes.
Right. Do as I say, but not as I do. Right. Yeah. I'm not
So,
modeling it. Yeah.
so I switched my major to philosophy. I thought, let me get to the bottom of everything. And I love philosophy, but again, there was no relationship necessarily between conceptual realms, which I found fascinating, and how that was integrated into human behavior. I realized I needed more experiential approach. So I was blessed when I was only 20 to meet a phenomenal teacher who had studied the various wisdom traditions of the world and was an incredible scholar, but also very practical applier of the wisdom of meditation and insight into the great traditions. So I spent a year, I finished college in 3 years, so I could go spend a year meditating and studying the world's traditions of wisdom. And that was really amazingly cool. I was blessed to have these great insights. But then I thought, okay, what am I going to actually do in the world? I became a teacher of the Alexander technique, which is an amazing method for developing stage presence. And one of the people who was studying the Alexander technique was one of the leading corporate consultants in the world. And he and I connected, and he invited me to speak on a corporate seminar that he was leading in Switzerland. This is in 1979. And the head of HR for this multinational said, we want this young American guy on all of our corporate programs around the world. So all of a sudden, I'm flying around the world teaching people twice my age, how to think more creatively.
So, okay. So, one of you've written this classic book. I mean, there's many books that you've written, and I think, they're all, have their own merit, but the one that you're probably the most known for is the book, How to Think Like Leonardo Da Vinci, 7 Steps to Genius Every Day. Right. And so that's a classic book. For those of you who haven't read that book, you should definitely read it. And we'll put the link for that. But so how did you get to that? And why did you write that book? Because that really set the stage for, you becoming well known about what you were talking about in this area.
Yes, it made a big
Splash.
difference. That was my 6th book.
Yeah, it's funny, right? It's not always the first one or the second one. Right? That's a lesson in keep going in itself, right?
Big time. Well, my first one was my master's thesis, which then got published and translated into 16 languages. And it's still in print today, 42 years later. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, that's cool. You learn a lot when you write a book. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, what else am I interested in that I want to learn more about that might be helpful to people? So that's how I decided what I would write. And then I would translate that into a seminar, which the funny thing is, my first corporate client, besides the international flying around doing these 5-day seminars, when I moved back to the US in 1982, my first client that hired me independently and not with this other consultant was DuPont, the DuPont Learning Resources Organization in Wilmington, Delaware. And they put me on retainer. And I didn't even know what a retainer was, but then I found out they give you money every month to teach them the stuff I love to teach. So after 2 years, I had taught them pretty much everything I knew. But I thought, this is too sweet, this retainer thing. I need to make up some new stuff. So I, wrote another book, and
That's
I wound up,
so there's a practical aspect to it, right?
very practical.
Yeah. So, but it sounds like you combined a lot of the stuff that you had been studying, the philosophy, the psychology, the creativity, all of those things. And then how did you come up with this? And
Sure.
you know what I mean?
Yes. So in these seminars, the through line theme was creativity, innovation, leadership. And I would always tell stories about Leonardo da Vinci because he was one of my childhood heroes. My grandmother's Italian. She introduced me to Leonardo when I was 6 or 7 years old. It was in the early 90s. I was speaking for YPO, Young Presidents Organization. They were having one of their big events. They're called universities in Washington, D.C. And I was invited to speak about creativity and innovation. But I knew they were having one of these universities in Florence, Italy, and I really wanted to get invited. So I pictured the scenario. I pictured that the education chair for Florence might approach me and ask me, if we were to invite you, what would you do? We want something really special because everybody wants to go to Florence. Well, that's exactly what happened. And I just spontaneously looked him in the eye and I said, how about how to think like Leonardo da Vinci? And he said, can you really do that? And I said, sure.
Oh, how funny. Oh my gosh. Okay, so a couple things on that, because I'm going to ask you a little bit more about tips, like how can the leaders listening think like Leonardo da Vinci, right? So how can they bring in their own genius? So I'm going to ask you that in a minute, but I've got to stop and ask about the picturing thing, right? So you pictured this happening and it happened.
Yes,
Say
exactly.
more about that, because we talk about that on this podcast a lot, right? In terms of the synchronicity of things, and also how sometimes what you're picturing actually can happen because it's already happened in your mind. But
Well,
talk a little bit more about you
sure.
in that, because I think that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, what's fascinating, the most fascinating thing about it was this, and it's one of the principles of being creative and creative leadership. It's following something that may seem, well, quite creative and sort of impossible. When I said,
Or
first of all,
crazy.
I've been musing about this, and I had really pictured this scene, and I thought, it wasn't just out of the blue because it was a logical thing. They come and they evaluate speakers. If they think you might be a possibility, they're going to come and talk to you. I knew everybody wanted to go to Florence. It was
Right.
not too wild a thing to think about. So there's a logical think it through what might happen component to this. And then I just had this leap of the imagination. I said, well, look, it's in Italy. I really want to get invited. They'll have to invite me if I say how to think like Leonardo da Vinci.
Right.
And the guy said, can you really do that? And I said, sure. Now, my joke is I call this the chutzpah principle of intelligence. Chutzpah is having just nerve. It's having just a sense of being able to pull something off that might not really.
Right. Just going with it, basically.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Uh,
And so, I mean, the things that manifest from that are pretty amazing because you're seizing the opportunity in the moment is what I mean.
but I also, in very practical terms, it's creative confidence, and one of the things I help people develop, I help people at all levels, but especially leaders, develop their creative confidence, and that's easier to do when you understand the principles of creative thinking, which most people don't. It's not something you learn in school. It's not something they teach in graduate school. It's not something they teach in most leadership development programs.
Okay, so tell us, what are some of the principles of creative thinking?
Sure. Well, the first one is the first principle for thinking like Leonardo da Vinci,
Yeah.
which is to carefully consider the most important questions in your life. I mean, this is obviously important for personal fulfillment, as well as creating a corporate vision, mission, values. I lead strategic planning programs for my clients for many, many years. And that's about asking them questions that they might not have previously considered. So creative questions are open-ended questions. They're questions that are about exploring something that you might not have previously considered. If you want to be really creative, start with the question. I'll give you an example. How can I develop my creativity? What if I'm more creative than I thought I was? Because I work with a lot of engineers, a lot of PhDs, a lot of scientists, right? And they don't think they're creative, so they overanalyze everything. They don't want to make a decision without consultants, not our kind of consultant, but
Right. No, I know.
numbers type consultants
Yeah.
telling them it's okay, so they don't have to take the blame if it goes wrong. And the truth is, those people don't usually hire me because they're too scared. I get the ones who have this glimmer that there might be more of a possibility than they previously imagined, and who recognize that the world's become so complex that you have to think creatively. You have to learn how to cultivate your intuition. You have to understand intuition. And so it helps. I guide them first to learn the process of asking questions that are more likely to inspire their creative process.
You mentioned intuition,
Yes.
and we've talked about this on the podcast as well. So say more about that, because we live in a world where we reward rational, logical thinking, and you just described that. And you see it in the academic world as well, right? It's like, you know, well, the science must support this, which is great. I mean, there is validity to that. And yet we close the door often into the intuitive parts of ourselves. So how does that apply to creativity in your mind? Because most of the creative people that I work with, that's a big, big part of their whole being.
Well, this is the wonderful thing about having Leonardo da Vinci as our role model.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reason we generally think of him as perhaps humanity's greatest genius is he was a genius of both art and science. And we tend to think of things as either or. But for Leonardo, his science was his art was his science. He said, study the science of art and the art of science. Mm-hmm. So what I guide people to do is, how do you activate those two modalities in a harmonious way? How do you think creatively, imaginatively? How do you nurture your intuition? How do you learn to literally listen to your gut, feel it in your bones, have your blood whisper to you? These are the kind of things people say, I knew it in my heart of hearts. Mm-hmm. How do you actually get in touch with your heart of hearts? So there's a big somatic through line in my work right from the very beginning, and I help people do that. Then how do you translate that into rational, logical terms so that other people can understand it?
One of the objections I hear about intuition often is this whole notion of, okay, but how do I know that that's not just conditioning or bias or whatever, that I'm listening to my gut, but that could be biased, or it could be my conditioning from my culture or whatever it is. So what's the difference? Like, what's the difference between that and intuition?
It's a great question. And that's the second principle for thinking like Leonardo da Vinci, which is dimostrazione, which is you have to learn to be really open-minded, really curious, like a passionate child, and then shift modes and critique what you've come up with and ask just those questions. That ability to shift between the playful, expansive, imaginative mode and following these nonverbal body sensations that speak to you, and learning how to translate those. That's it. See, Leonardo, and by the way, Thomas Edison, and pretty much every other great genius in human history kept a notebook, and they jotted down the crazy things that arose at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Right. Right.
Thomas Edison turned those into 1,093 United States patents and 3 entirely new industries that changed the world forever. So it's not just for artists. This was one of the greatest business geniuses who ever lived, and many others have learned this process about how do you trust your gut, and then how do you shift where you take apart and analyze and critique your ideas, and then go back to your gut and back to your imagination and move between these two modalities. So that is the 5th principle for thinking like Leonardo, which is arte scienza, balance those 2 modes. And we teach people how to do that in very practical ways.
Most of the people I talk to think they have an open mind. I don't know anybody who says, no, I have a closed mind, right? And there is a tendency I see, and I see it in myself as well. So it's not just, it's not just, I'm not observing it in others, right? I observe it in myself as well, that we tend to jump to judgment rather than suspend it. And that blocks off curiosity.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about how people, because that's closing off the whole creative process, how
Yes.
people can suspend judgment at least? It's not like totally get rid of it, but at least suspend judgment.
It's a great challenge. It's a leap of evolution for a lot of people to genuinely be able to do that. And part of how people who think they can do it, well, we find out if they can do it when we do a 360 for them, for example, and then we narrate what was learned, and we coach them to take it in. And you can read right away from the body language whether people are taking it in or not, and you can see the most important thing is, do they make the substantive changes? You say you're open-minded, but if 18 of the people that we interviewed say that they don't have the experience, that you're listening to them and you still insist you're a good listener, and 3 months later they say you haven't changed, you don't have an open mind.
Right. And you have a blind spot, right? Somewhere, right?
You're wasting and then I raise my fee to, if I'm coaching you, because you're not paying attention. So maybe if I charge you even more, you'll listen.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, and that's a whole other thing that we could talk about, the feedback and all of that. There's so many things that I wanted to ask you, but I know we have limited time. So I'm going to move to asking you about connection, because that's another thing you write about, is the art of connection. And I think, creativity is such a big topic for leaders, but then this whole notion of workplaces now more than ever are craving connection and community.
Yes.
So when you talk about the art of connection, what do you think leaders can do today to foster deeper connection in their organizations?
Well, first of all, so I wrote the book, The Art of Connection, because after so many years of teaching people the thinking skills of geniuses, how to be creative, how to be innovative, what I saw in actually working with real leaders is that the way you make these great ideas happen is through your ability to connect with others. And I learned from my clients who were wonderful at this ability, the proverbial common touch, the ability to just connect with everybody. Everybody would light up when they would interact with these folks, whether they were at the most junior level of the organization or if it was a board member. There's just this sense of fundamental respect, usually a really good sense of humor, and just this wonderful humanity that brings out the best in people. And I saw that that's the gift that helps people really translate these great ideas. So the way I framed it is in a motto that is the motto for the book, but it's a lesson. And I like to put mottos in Latin because they're make them seem more important, but this one's really important. In Latin, it is conjungere ad solvendum. And translated into English, it is connect before solving.
Mm-hmm.
Connect before solving. So in many parts of the world, people understand that you have to connect with the other humans first. And there's a lot of time and energy spent in building our relationship before we even discuss business. And in the States, people tend to be the opposite. They're highly transactional. They're just, let's get down to business, X's and O's, numbers and data and so on.
Without the relationship,
Without the relationship.
no time on the relationship. Right. Absolutely.
But what I notice is the deal's way better if you make the connection first. It's going to be better for everybody. You think better. You think together. You feel better. You'll live longer. Your immune system will be strengthened. You'll be happier. I'm not this.
I know there's data to support that. That's not, it's not just,
it's overwhelming.
Platitudes,
it's
right?
I just feel good platitudes. And I have this tendency myself. I'm highly motivated in what I do. I like to make the deal. I like to get it done. But I remember, so this woman called me up about this opportunity, and she mentioned somehow in the conversation that she had something going on in her life. I think she just had a baby or something like that. She'd been away, right? So I paused and I just thought, this is how I've trained myself to be awake and tuned into that person. I said, gee, having a baby, that might be a kind of a big deal. So I just paused and I just asked her, how does it feel? And what's it like for you in the transition between having this child and now being back at work and running this seminar? And it was, first of all, it was just wonderful. Like, I relaxed. My heart opened. I just felt more present in the moment and connected with this person. She connected with me. Now I wasn't just another potential vendor.
Right.
She really wanted to. She wanted.
Right. Because we say, well, it's not personal, it's business. But there's also
But you know who says that? That's what the mafia says before they kill you. That's not real business.
But it is personal, right?
Yeah,
I mean, everything is personal when you're
everything is personal,
right? When you're talking about human beings. So I mean, you're dealing with human beings. People like to term in organizations human resources, right? So it's not a resource; it's a human, and that there's a big difference there. So I love that. What do you think is the one thing leaders should be focused on for the future? Like, as you look at creativity, you look at connection, you look at the world right now, you've got your philosophy background, all and the political science interest. What should leaders be focused on?
Well, number one, character and integrity.
Yeah.
Just character and integrity. And what that means is that you do what you say you're going to do. You are very careful with what you promise.
Yeah.
It's in some ways it's more important than others because we see it's brought to our attention when there's a gap between those, but people seem to be succeeding in all kinds of realms by lying, cheating, and stealing. And the very first principle before you get to higher value is don't lie, cheat, or steal.
Right.
So,
well, if you're a role model, right? If in fact leadership is role modeling, there's a piece of that in there as well.
And that it's the goodness and truth, beauty and goodness.
Right.
Truth is important, goodness is important, and beauty is important. And that's often overlooked. So how to make the workplace more beautiful? Then those people will want to come back to work. How to make it more welcoming, how to make it more connecting, how to make it more fun, and then it'll be more, and how to give it a higher purpose. Because if you feel you're doing something beyond just earning a living, but you're making some kind of positive difference in the world through what you do, that gives you more energy to go to work than almost anything else.
And it's funny how simple these things are, and I find over the years just doing this work and talking to so many different people about the same work is that in the end, these principles that we all talk about are are pretty straightforward, and yet they're so hard because they're a long-term journey. It's not just okay, now you need to have, I have character. And so here's the 3 steps I need to follow to have character. It doesn't work that way, right?
Well, it is simple, but it's not easy.
Right.
And I mean, I remember when I was on my spiritual quest in my 20s, and I went and I met this famous meditation master from the Middle East. And there was this, everybody was hushed and silent and in deep meditative state. And the master walked in and he just said, "Don't do bad, good." Oh yeah. I just love the really basic fundamental, like start with ethics.
Right.
And ethics should be informed by purpose, and purpose by ethics. So really think through, how do I run a business, have a job, be in an organization? How can I help that enterprise make a positive difference in the world? To be a force for good, to be something that because, and this is where the healing organization comes in.
Yeah.
Here's some really, really good news. If you consistently, unvaryingly treat all your stakeholders with respect and care, all your stakeholders, not just your stockholders or your investors, but all of your stakeholders, not only will people feel more connected, not only will they be more engaged, not only people will love you more, not only will you sleep better at night, you'll make more money. Mm-hmm. So once you know that, how could you even think about doing anything else?
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot there, right? But the word respect, I think, is the one that is to be highlighted and punctuated as you talk, because I think that's something that we're short on today. So that respect word is big. Okay, finally, what inspirational quote or words of wisdom or whatever quote you want to leave us with as you depart the podcast today?
Okay, so I was recently, we have a social media company, and they wanted to put out these posts to promote it's the 25th year of How to Think Like Leonardo. We have this online video course we're promoting on LinkedIn and Facebook. So the head of this company asked me for my 50 best quotes from myself.
Oh.
I could put them up there.
Right.
So I'll tell you my number 1 quote from myself.
Okay, great.
It relates to
inspirational quote. Yeah, from you.
And it is
Michael Gelb.
It's either universal truth or it's BS. So what our job is bring forth the universal truth and then get people to pay attention to it. André Gide won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Here's another great quote. And he said that everything worth saying has already been said. But he added, since no one was listening, we have to say it again.
I love that. Oh my gosh. It's so true.
Right?
Right. Yeah. So that's leaving us with some words of wisdom here, both your quote and that one. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your wisdom. I'm sure people will as well. And in celebration of the 25th anniversary, we're putting the link for people who want to read the book. So
thank you so much.
Thank you.